Did you know there's an area of the brain that controls willpower? In the last 20 years, scientists have studied this extensively, and they've summarized that it's in the anterior mid-cingulate cortex, which will be abbreviated throughout this talk as the AMCC. But I'll also repeatedly say anterior mid-cingulate cortex, so maybe that gets solidified in your brain a little bit. So why does willpower matter to us? Why does it matter that we've been able to actually identify it as a scientific concept and even isolate where it's controlled in the brain? Well, willpower helps you do hard things, and hard things tend to lead to positive outcomes in life, be it academic, career, finance, or other areas. In fact, currently, I am doing a hard thing because in order to make this speech, I had to learn a lot more than I'm comfortable with of neuroanatomy, neurobiology, and the science behind these different studies. And I have to try to communicate that to you guys in a way that actually makes sense if you haven't read all the studies that I did and then had to understand them. So, you should do hard things because doing hard things is more rewarding to you and it leads to continuous improvement in your life, particularly in the realm of willpower. But before we go into why we should do hard things, let's clarify a little bit of information so that as we talk, you know what I'm actually discussing. So first thing, when we say hard things, what are we talking about? Hard things are things that you feel that you should do by your own definition, but that you don't really want to do in the moment. Or the inverse, which is not doing things that you would rather do, but you are forcing yourself not to do in the moment. So an example of doing hard things would be getting up early in the morning to go exercise or to study before class, studying after you get home when you don't want to, and then similarly related, something like I want to come home and I want to play video games, but instead I do something more productive. That would be not doing something. Or while I'm sitting in between classes, I play on my phone. Instead of playing on my phone, I decide I'm not going to do that, and instead I'm going to do something that's more productive by my own standards. And then as you see, I've got a few different slides to talk about the anterior mid-cingulate cortex so you can get familiar with where it's at. It's kind of on the front half of the brain, and it's located in a highly interconnected area, which has implicated it in a number of functions. So several of the studies that I read actually suggest the anterior mid-cingulate cortex plays a role in almost every brain function, from minor to major, from a minor role to a major role. But the main thing that it does is resource allocation with the goal of what's called allostasis. Allostasis is essentially trying to keep balance in your body. So you might have heard the term biostasis in reference to biology, where we want to keep the biosphere more or less the same. Allostasis is that, but for your body. So one of the scientists that did a lot of work in the willpower realm is Parvizi, publishing in Neuron in 2013. What he did was actually inserted brain stimulation devices into the brain. As you can see, this is sort of the mesh net that he created. This specific one I couldn't find for sure if that was what he used in this particular study, but he does a lot of different neurosurgery studies because he's a neurosurgeon. And what he did was he stimulated the anterior mid-cortex specifically with a brain probe, and then asked the subjects who were conscious to describe what they were feeling. What they described was a will to act. They said that it felt like I was going into a storm, but that I was going in order to do something. So it wasn't that I was involuntarily experiencing something that I didn't want to, it was that I was about to experience something and I wanted to overcome whatever that challenge was. And the need for impending action is one of the things that he talks about throughout that study. So now that we've got a little bit of background on what we're talking about, let's talk about why we want to do hard things. The first being reward systems. The most important of these that I want to talk about is the internal reward systems, which is primarily focused on dopamine. So your dopamine system is basically your pleasure system. It's influenced in drugs of abuse. They overstimulate your dopamine system, so that's just to get an idea of what dopamine does. It gives you the sense of pleasure. And so Tobler in the Journal of Neuroscience, 2005, found in his study that the greater the perceived effort that you're going through, perception by your own perception, the greater the reward in dopamine is. So what he did was basically gave people varying challenges and found that the harder the challenge was, the greater the dopamine spike that they got, that occurred. Now externally, doing hard things can lead to kind of accomplishing your goals, right? Most of our goals are external focused, higher pay, good jobs, academic achievements, higher grades, awards, things like that. And it kind of makes sense, right, that as we talk about things like pay, as you do hard things, you acquire skills that are more rare, and you end up in a group that is smaller. So as you have those rare skills and you have less competition, you tend to get paid more. Similarly, if you're looking for respect or prestige, even if you're not looking for it, it usually comes naturally from doing things that other people aren't willing to do, so that the people who aren't willing to do those things come to you and ask for advice and eventually want to award you because they say, you know way more about this topic than I do, because you spent way more time studying and learning on that topic. Yes, and Lisa Feldman Barrett in the journal Cortex in 2019 published a review on the anterior mid-cingulate of the cortex. Basically what she found was that the greater AMCC function and higher volume in the AMCC itself actually leads to positive outcomes in health, academics, and career. But beyond simply the reward and award aspect, if we look at doing things that are hard, what we find is we actually improve throughout our life in the different areas we're working on. So as we just discussed, talking about increased AMCC volume, so that's talking about the size. And Colcom in the Journal of Gerontology in 2006, studying geriatric patients, he was able to essentially correlate the larger size of this area of the brain with greater willpower. What he did was he took two groups and subjected them to the type of workout for 6 months. The first group did 3 aerobic workouts per week, and they were hard workouts that they were usually doing zone 2 to zone 3 cardio. And the second group was doing an hour, 3 times a week of stretching and yoga, which was considered easy by the subject's own interpretation. And at the end of the 6 months, he measured their AMCC at the beginning and then measured at the end of 6 months. What he found was that the first group doing the harder thing was either stable in their size of their anterior mid-cingulate cortex, and in some cases increased their size, which with geriatric patients, which you normally see, is a decrease in size, even over the 6-month period, which is what happened in group 2. So the idea is even doing movement and exercise that's not hard can have physical benefits. The neurological benefits are only there if you do hard things. So doing the hard workouts can actually lead to not just physical benefits, but neurological benefits as well. Looking at McCaffrey in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition 2009, he did a study also looking at the anterior mid-cingulate cortex and focusing on willpower. And what he did was he took subjects that were formerly obese, and he had a certain body mass index assignment for this, and then kept their weight off for at least a year. And what he did was put monitoring their brain in fMRI. He subjected them to food cues, mostly photos of food that they said that they liked. And then he monitored their anterior mid-cingulate cortex activity. What he found was, as they were viewing these foods and talking about how they didn't want to eat them, their activity in their AMCC spiked. So what they're able to say with this is that in resisting temptation, you're actually activating this area of your brain because you're employing willpower. And so the conclusions of these 2 studies and about a dozen other studies that I don't have the time to cite or the understanding to fully understand, they basically found that specific acts of willpower, such as resisting tempting food or getting yourself up to do a hard workout, can lead to broad willpower effects, so the growth of willpower broadly. So if we do something in one area, this willpower can be applied in a different area. And they also found that doing hard things leads to an ability to do harder things. So essentially what you do is you crest the top here, and now you've done that, you know you can do that, and later on you can push yourself even further. It's kind of like lifting a weight, right? Like exercise. When we say, I can't lift this weight, and then you do it once, all of a sudden down the road, lifting this weight doesn't seem like such a big deal. But there are critics who have concerns about the idea of maximizing anterior mid-cingulate cortex function. And it's kind of illustrated in the book Beyond Good and Evil that Nietzsche wrote in 1886. And he was discussing, obviously, in a much more philosophical way. But what he said was, battle not with monsters, lest ye become a monster. And if you gaze into the abyss gazes also into you. And what he was essentially saying was that even though we can push ourselves hard, we have to be careful not to push ourselves too hard into an area of hurting ourselves. And where this comes in a much more direct way that we can understand is in anorexia nervosa, which is the deadliest of the psychological disorders. And people with anorexia nervosa show a hyperactive anterior mid-cingulate cortex. But there's been no correlations or causal studies that show that just because you activate your anterior midcingulate cortex more, it's a positive feedback loop that you can't stop. So there is no slippery slope here that's going to push you into hyperactivity simply from increasing activity. But there is an implicit argument that people sometimes make. I don't know that I've ever heard someone say, you shouldn't do hard things, but what often happens is we make excuses in our own lives, right? This morning, for instance, I didn't go to the gym because I had to get ready for this presentation, which was an excuse because I totally had time. But when we make an excuse for not doing something hard, what we're essentially saying is, I shouldn't do that hard thing. So with this implicit argument, we can actually find that we're lying to ourselves simply by going through the process of, what would I feel if I actually did this thing? And what we tend to find is, if I did this thing, at the end I would feel accomplished. If I don't do this thing, then I feel a feeling of regret. And that's why we should do hard things, because they're more rewarding for us through the dopamine system, and they lead to continuous improvement and the ability to do hard things in the future. And I'll leave you with just one thing, which is the idea that you don't actually get a life without pain. What you do get is to choose your pain. And you get either the pain of regret or the pain of discipline. Thank you.